Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this talk organized by the Middle East Institute. I'd also like to acknowledge the help of the Department of Malay Studies of the National University of Singapore, who helped to put together this event. The subject of the talk today is Iraq and the Middle East Order. And as many of us are aware, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, followed by a near civil war and the uncertain appearance of a new political order, have upended a host of long-standing power relations in the Middle East. The treatment of the issues and the problems that arose out of the Iraq crisis will preoccupy policymakers in the Middle East and around the world for a considerable time, until a new balanced and stable order emerges. Our speaker today will examine the present circumstances in Iraq and will propose a number of alternative courses of action that might chart a more just, open, and prosperous future for Iraq and its neighbors. And our speaker is Dr. Ali Allawi. He is the former Minister of Trade and Minister of Defense in the cabinet appointed by the interim Iraq Governing Council from September 2003 until 2004, and then subsequently Minister of Finance in the Iraqi transitional government between 2005 and 2006. In 2008, he was elected a senior visiting fellow at Princeton, and in 2000, he was elected fellow at the Carr Center at the Kennedy School in Harvard. Dr. Allawi was born in Baghdad in 1947 and graduated from MIT in 1968 in civil engineering. He went on to do postgraduate studies in regional planning at the LSE and then an MBA at Harvard. He has been active in the opposition to the Ba'athist regime in Iraq from about 1968. He spent a number of years in finance in various positions outside of Iraq, including a position at the World Bank. In 1978, he co-founded Arab International Finance, a merchant bank based in London, and in 1992, he founded FISA Group, which manages 2 hedge funds. From 1999 to 2002, he was a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. He is a writer, and his 2 major books are The Crisis of Islamic Civilization and The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. You will find Dr. Allawi's books at the counter outside if you are interested later. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Ali Allawi.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The topic that we chose to talk about is Iraq and the Middle East Order. But I think before we delve into the current situation and prospects for the country, I think it would be worthwhile to ask ourselves about this entity that we call Iraq. And the reason why I ask this question, because the identity and definition of Iraq goes really to the heart of the crisis that we are presently passing through. Iraq is not a conventional nation, at least not in the commonly understood terms of the word. It appears to lack, if you look at its modern history, the basic or the essential elements of nationhood. There have been many definitions of what a nation is or isn't, but I think one of the most persuasive, as far as I'm concerned, is the one given by the 19th century philologist and philosopher Ernest Renan, where he said a nation is what people have chosen to forget together rather than what people have chosen to remember. It is the forgetting of the wrongs and of the hurts done to and within communities that is an essential factor to creating a sense of nationhood in a society which has several ethnicities and sects in it. So a nation's memory in that case must be selective. You must try to forget the injustices done to this group or that group over history, and you must try to transcend and overcome them. Iraq is also a nation that is not built on a dynasty or monarchies in the European sense of the word. There are very few countries in the Middle East, I might add, that are based on historic association of the territory of the state with the dynasty or monarchy. Saudi Arabia, I think, is probably the only state in the Middle East which functions as a state because of its founding by a dynasty and continues to be associated with the dynastic factor, as it were. Now, Iraq, it's true, was ruled by the Hashemites, the Hashemite monarchy that came at the end of World War I and was overthrown in 1958. But the Hashemites in Iraq did not succeed in conflating the identity of Iraq as a nation with their own dynasty. And even in a country like Jordan, which is associated with the Hashemite kingdom, it is not so much the dynastic effort that creates a sense of national identity in Jordan. And the state itself is really very much the creation of one man, the political genius of Hussein, King Hussein. Iraq also is not built on the dominance of one institution. For example, the military, which was the backbone of the Prussian state. In the 1930s in Iraq, there was an attempt to create the military and the military cult, as it were, in order to create a sense of belonging and nationhood. And the army in Iraq continued to have a very strong, even mystical relationship to the common man. But the misadventures of the last 30 years have really put paid to that idea. And the idea that the army or the military can form the basis of a nationhood went out of the window with the degradation of that institution by the political groups that worked with it. Iraq is also is not a nation defined by its geography. It's true that Iraq's other name is Rafidain, the land of the Rafidain, the land of the two rivers. But you can't say that the modern territory of Iraq is contiguous with the historical land of the two rivers. It doesn't have the same geographic identity as, say, Egypt does, where the Nile Valley is the backbone of the identity of the country throughout the millennia. Iraq, it is true, is bounded by the two rivers, but on one side you have vast deserts where tribesmen and nomads used to roam, and on the other side, in the northeastern side, you have the mountains of Kurdistan, where another ethnicity, the Kurdish ethnicity, dwells in relationship to the rest of Iraq, which is overwhelmingly Arab. So it doesn't have the civilizational unity that the land of the pharaohs does, or even Greater Syria does. And when the term in the past was applied to that part of the world as a fertile crescent, it was a weak attempt to connect the idea of Iraq with this greater notion. It is true that a nation can be built on a common religious identity, and the vast majority of Iraqis are Muslims. But the idea that the Muslims of Iraq should form a nation, the way that, say, the Muslims of India, of British India, did, is really not meaningful in the context of Iraq, because the vast majority, as I said, are Muslim, unless you're speaking in terms of the founding of an Islamic state, which is another matter entirely. And it is only very, very recently, I would say in the last 15 years, that the idea that the majority of the country, the sectarian majority, the Shia Muslims, should form the core of a Shia Arab nation has been broached. But that is really a controversial construct, and it is uncertain how Iraq as an idea can be conflated with its Shia Arab majority. Neither is Iraq founded on the basis of a text, a commonly agreed text, like, for example, the United States, where the Constitution has a certain sacred characteristic to it and becomes basically the document around which disparate people come together. We have a constitution, and the constitution that we developed in 2005 could have been such a document, but in reality the way it was cobbled together under extreme time constraints with many gaps in it did not make it a document that could form the basis of a new national compact. And we've had constitutions before. This is not the first constitution that Iraq has had. We had the Basic Law of 1926. We had constitutions, some provisional, some permanent, after each revolutionary cycle. None of these documents had the effect of bringing the people together. So, and we don't have great constitutional philosophers or thinkers like Jefferson or Hamilton that would allow us to create the idea of a state, of a nation based on a constitutional document. And then Iraq is not a country built on the residue of empire like Iran or Turkey, which were the hearts of multinational, sometimes global empires, but were shrunk as a result of wars to their core state. It is true that the land of Iraq was the core of the Abbasid Empire, which is a kind of universal state. But it never formed, as it were, the hard core of that state, the way, let's say, the Turks of the Ottoman Empire ultimately became the hard core of that state. And although we do appropriate, as it were, the legacy of Babylon and Assyria and Sumeria as part of the national legacy of Iraq, you can't say that the pre-Islamic legacy of Iraq is a founding idea of the nation, the way that, say, the idea of Athens or Sparta formed the idea of modern Greek nationhood. And in that case, I would think that archaeology, as it were, has not formed the basis of the national identity. So Iraq really has a very complex patrimony. And it has many layered loyalties and many layered identities. And it is unusual that these identities are kept aside while the Iraqiness of Iraqis becomes, as it were, the founding identity or the principal identity. And usually what has happened in modern history is that one aspect of Iraq's many-layered identity is privileged and is then made to be the defining features of the country. From World War I up to very recently, with some gaps. It was the idea of Iraq as being the fulcrum of the Arab nation that was promoted, but at the expense of course, other identities. And when you talk about Iraq as part of the Arab nation, obviously you privilege the greater, the Arab world, to the individual part, which is Iraq. So it is a country of many parts, some larger than others, but it is in some ways a fragmented identity. And one of the main problems of the country has been the failure to impose any of these single identities on it and make it the defining feature. So the question becomes really, and this goes to the heart of the issue, can you create a nation or a sense of nationhood out of these disparate parts? I believe you can in the case of Iraq. There are other countries, there are other examples of countries that have created a powerful sense of identity in smaller or larger scale by transcending these parts in a new compact, as it were. And I think in Iraq that is indeed possible and desirable. But I think it would only succeed if you acknowledge that these different parts are real and that they are connected perhaps to other parts, maybe not in that country, but nevertheless they are to be acknowledged, in some cases even celebrated, but always to the not to be privileged over the sense of the whole, or the sense of the greater unifying factor. Parts of nations, religions, sects, cultures, and tribes live in Iraq. But Iraq is not really a multicultural or a multi-ethnic society in the modern pluralist sense of the word. We haven't inherited the institutionalized multi-ethnicity, say, of the Ottoman Empire, which was based on the recognition of the various parts connected to the ruler. And I don't think we have the idea of multi-ethnicity that exists in other more formally pluralistic societies. So when you talk about Iraq as a multi-ethnic country, it is a statement of fact rather than a statement that defines the country politically. And the multi-ethnicity aspects of it has been disrupted very, very seriously in recent times. It existed very successfully at the social level for centuries before. But because of the attempt to impose one and to privilege one identity over the other, that has seeped into the political culture and has shaken very seriously the social connections that kept the country's main groups in balance. In Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire, as I'm sure you mostly know, until the end of World War I, when it was put together as a state really on no better vision or grounds than the requirements of the imperial powers then competing for privilege and position in the post-Ottoman order. And you can speculate that the idea of Iraq emerged first when the two civil servants, Mr. Sykes, associated with the British Foreign Office, and Mr. George Picot, associated with the French, decided to carve up the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire into various states. And the lines that Iraq finally assumed was, to a very large extent, a result of imperial politics and post-World War era. It came up with two provinces of the former Ottoman Empire, and to which was added a third in 1926, which by and large made up the modern state of Iraq. It was not so much an invented nation or a contrived nation, as some people have claimed, but as I have tried to show, it is also is not a natural nation in the way that, say, Egypt or even Morocco has been historically. It was up to the state, therefore, to define the contours of this nation. And I believe the first Iraqi state, which started in 1921 and which came to a crashing end in 2003, failed in the task of defining a sense of nationhood in the state which was emerged out of World War I. The three phases that have defined Iraq's modern history, you can roughly call them that defined the first Iraqi state, were the monarchical phase, which ended in a revolution in 1958, the republican state, which ended by my calculation, by the assumption of the Ba'ath Party of power in 1968, and the attempt to impose a one-party totalitarian dictatorship, which started in 1979. These are the three careers, as it were, of the first Iraqi state. And they came crashing down, as I said, as a result of the American invasion and occupation, which put an end to the contours of that state. So I believe that the first Iraqi state, which started in 21 and ended in 2003, could have created a sense of nationhood, could have created a sense of common citizenship if it was ruled under wiser and more far-sighted governments. We had a world-class leader in the person of King Faisal I of Iraq. But he died in 1933, 10 years after nearly 10 years in power, and was not able to build the institutions of the modern state to the point where they could withstand the various pressures and tensions that emerged out of this very, very complex society. And as you emerged into the 1940s and 50s, Iraq could not be insulated from the political hurricanes that buffeted the Middle East. So you had to contend with all kinds of issues like the rise of Arab nationalism, the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the rise of the Shah's Iran in the 1970s as a regional power, followed by the rise of the Islamic Revolution, the threat of the Islamic Revolution that came from Iran. All of these very, very powerful currents obviously constrained the ability of the state to come to terms with creating a sense of strong binding citizenship and nationhood. And most of these phases in which Iraq, the first state, was involved, ended in one way or another in a catastrophic collapse. The monarchical phase ended in 1958 with a coup d'etat where the king and the royal family were killed, and the major political figure who dominated Iraqi politics throughout the first half of the 20th century, Nuri Said, was murdered and then dragged ignominiously in the street. The Republican phase ended with, again, hugely turbulent events in the 1960s with coups and counter-coups, civil wars, not civil wars, but very, very serious disturbances in parts of the country like Mosul. And then you had the third state, the Ba'athist state, which put Iraq into three terrible confrontations. First with Iran, where the Iran-Iraq war lasted for nearly 10 years and left hundreds of thousands of people killed or maimed, and followed by the adventure in Kuwait, which ended in a complete collapse of the Iraqi army and an ignominious defeat by the Allied forces and the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. And then finally, of course, the botched attempt to stand up to the increasing pressures from the international community represented by the United States, which ended in the invasion and occupation of the country. So if you are giving, as it were, a grade to these various governments that run this country, you would see that you have to give them failing grades, because I don't think Iraq, there's any country in the modern world that has been invaded or occupied as much as Iraq has. We've had several occupations and we've entered into several wars, none of which we emerged out of in a successful way. By invading and occupying Iraq in 2003, the United States basically became the midwife for the birth of what I call the second Iraqi state. But the way that happened is also extraordinary, and in many ways extraordinarily inept, because the occupation authorities, when they came and took over the responsibility of managing the Iraqi state, they dismantled the key props of the old order, which was at that point a dictatorial tyranny based on a command structure, without defining the outlines of the second state that was going to replace it. So with the old rules, as it were, declared null and void, and the new rules still unwritten, the Iraqi government machinery, and I speak here from first-hand experience, spun out of control after 2003. Parts imploded, parts ceased to function, parts became hopelessly degraded and corrupted. The second Iraqi state was also challenged by the remnants of the old order. The first Iraqi state did not collapse and go away. Parts of it stayed on and threatened and challenged the new order. It was challenged by radical jihadis who had declared war on the United States, but also, I might add, by neighboring countries. None of the neighboring countries, with the possible exception of Kuwait, felt easy or pleased or even indifferent to what happened in Iraq. Most felt directly threatened by these changes and did their utmost to try to manage the pace and scope of change, each for their own reasons, because the entire balance of power in the Middle East was severely shaken. I've written about that in my book, so I will not go over these grounds again, but I believe that that period, which started in 2003, ended sometime around 2007. It was in fact the first phase of what I call the crisis of the second Iraqi state. So what do I mean by that? The first phase of the post-2003 period dealt with the fundamental outlines of what the new state of Iraq was going to look like. Now, the first Iraqi state, which started in, as I said, after World War I and ended in 2003, had a certain fundamental principles, unstated mainly, upon which it was built. It was built on the notion of a strong centralized state. It was built on the notion of a strong military and security apparatuses. It was built on the notion of a dominant political class drawn mainly from the Sunni Arab community. These are the features of the first Iraqi state, and they continued to be the features from 1921 until 2003, in spite of the fact that they went through monarchies, republics, and Ba'athist dictatorships. This did not change. The second Iraqi state, which was born in 2003, reversed all of these. At first, it reversed all of these. It was built on the idea of a non-centralized state, even a federal state. It was built on the idea of democracy, human rights, conventions that would stand against the idea of a strong military and a strong security force. And it was built on the idea of the non-dominance of the former political class based on the Sunni Arab minority. But apart from that, it had really precious else to offer as an alternative idea of how the new state should be formed. And the crisis that started when the American invasion, occupation took place, and we're still going through, is really to do with this. How are the new features of the second Iraqi state going to be organized, and what will be the shape of this new order on the one hand, and on the other hand, the violent resistance to the idea of this shift, this fundamental shift of identity. And the groups that declared war on the second Iraqi state were, in one way or another, trying to reverse these changes and to revert either to the status quo ante or to another altogether different structure and purpose for the Iraqi state. And the political process, the so-called political process that started with the handover of administration from an American-led occupation force to an interim Iraqi government in 2004, subsequently led to the elections for a transitional assembly, the referendum for a new constitution, parliamentary elections in late 2005, and new elections coming up now. They're ultimately to revolve around these fundamental issues, even though the players themselves may not consciously understand them to be the case. But it is to do with what is the shape of this new order that's coming about. When the United States came in, they sought to define the debate, to frame the debate on the future of Iraq in terms of democracy, freedoms, rights, and the buildings of the institutions of a modern democratic state. And the United States and those Iraqi liberals who believed in these thought that the creation, as it were, of the scaffolding of a democratic order and the rule of law in itself would push Iraq's tensions and conflicts aside, that they would be somehow reconciled through this new calculus of elections, constitutions, and human rights. But unfortunately, this did not turn out to be the case. The tensions and conflicts inside Iraq could not be resolved in the framework of the political process that was launched. And these forms, democracies, constitutions, rule of law, and so on, they helped to shroud, in some cases obscure, the serious power struggle that was going on underneath between those who wanted to reverse the process, wanted to go back to the status quo ante, and those who were determined to maintain the momentum to establishing the form of the second Iraqi state. And it was at this level that the elemental fight in Iraq was taking place, not at the level of milestones and elections and benchmarks and conferences, which I'm sure you had read about every other day. When I was in Iraq, there was a conference on this or a mission to that, and there were milestones relating to elections, constitutions, draft constitutions, and so on. But in reality, this shrouded the issue, and there was far more serious struggle going on underneath. And these issues were far, far more fundamental, but they were not stated. They were not articulated. I'll just mention a few of them. For example, were the Shia Arabs as a community able to equate the demographic majority with the right to determine and dominate the new state structures, especially the key ministries relating to security and the military? Were the Kurds able to solidify their autonomous status into something that would confirm them as a partner in a confederal rather than a federal Iraq, or even the beginning of a new Kurdish state? Would the Sunni Arab community acquiesce to their loss of power, even though it was at the hands of a foreign invader? And this is a very important psychological issue, because without this invasion taking place, many people would not have expected that this shift could ever take place in Iraq. And on the other side, of course, those who equate this shift with the foreign invasion make it legitimate to question, at least from their perspective, these institutions and the forms of the new Iraqi state. Was the Iraqi state to lose its centralized status and become a federal form? We started with a federal idea in 2005, promoted by a large number of important parties. We then swung to a centralized state. Now we're moving towards a kind of binational state. These are again critical issues that were not confronted head on. Will Iraq, for example, opt out of Arab causes, especially the Arab-Israeli conflict? Iraq, for good or ill, was seen as one of the sort of frontline states in the confrontation with Israel since 1948. And how successful is not a matter, but it was always factored into the calculations of the balance of power in the Middle East. Will Iraq just ignore this issue or just pay lip service to it and therefore no longer be an element of that? The other question is that will Iraq abandon its long-term hostility to Iran? Iran and Iraq have a very complex and intertwined relationships over the decades. I won't say over the centuries, because Iraq was not really an independent country. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the Iranian-Iraqi relationships, say in the 19th century, were to do more with the Ottoman-Iranian relationships rather than with Iranian-Iraqi relationships. But our relationships with Iran have been fraught with all kinds of issues. And it's not necessarily defined by the Sunni-Shia divide. In the case, for example, in the 1950s, we had a very powerful military and security pact with Iran, even though the country in Iraq was dominated by a monarchy. We had reasonably cordial relationships during the period when General Qasim was president. Then it moved back into being a kind of a cold peace. Then the Ba'athists, when they came, it moved into a cold war, followed by a real war, and so on. So it's a very, very complex and intertwined relationship. But this issue was never actually debated as such. You either were against Iranian encroachments or you quietly tolerated them as part of the internal power struggle. The other issue which was never discussed is, will the religious establishment, which is a very, very critical factor in the organizing of the Shia community in Iraq, will they be given a formal authority in the new Iraqi state? Will the US demand and receive special acknowledgement and status for its role in Iraq? And the answer to that is yes, because we signed a status of forces agreement followed by a whole list of trade, economic, cultural, and other relationships. These were all critical issues that were jumbled up with the collapse of the Iraqi state, and of course they were overshadowed by the incredible levels of violence and the fight against the insurgents and Al-Qaeda. Until, I would say, February of 2006, the undeclared war between the insurgents and the United States, and between the insurgents and Al-Qaeda, and between Al-Qaeda and the Shia civil population, was somehow not called a civil war. But after the incident in Samarra, where the shrines of very, very important Shia saints were blown up by operatives of Al-Qaeda, I think Iraq did go into a civil war condition. And I would not hesitate to say that there was a vicious civil war between February of 2006 and which ended somewhere around the end of 2007, beginning 2008. This is not your conventional war, with trenches and two sides and so on. It was a real mix-up. And it was not a war of all against all, but a very near Hobbesian state, where the war pitted the insurgents, Al-Qaeda, elements of the Sunni Arab parties in power, against the militias of the Mahdi army, which is connected to one of the major Shia groups, to a lesser extent the Badr brigades, and with logistical and manpower support from the Iraqi military. It was local groups fighting at a local level, using all types of tactics, such as random killings, suicide bombings, assassinations, expulsions, and the terrorizing of innocent civilians and families. The former government just watched, basically, and made futile pronouncements. But there's no doubt that the parties who were involved in the government were involved also in the preparation of this war and its execution. So it did not take place, as it were, ex nihilo, out of nothing. The groundwork for that civil war was already being laid in the period between 2003, just soon after 2003. In this war, the Mahdi army, which is associated with the Muqtada Sadr group, did most of the dirty work, I would say. Others were provided with weapons, money, and intelligence. And in the end, and I really hate to say this, the civil war ended because one side won. It's really as simple as that. Civil wars usually end, or at least phases of civil wars end, when one side prevails over the other. By the end of 2007, the Shias had dominated Baghdad and appeared unstoppable. That's when the surge took place, the famous American surge. And the surge, in fact, put a stop to this. But at the end of this war, tens of thousands of people were killed. Millions, maybe 2 million people were displaced. And entire areas were ethnically cleansed, and many people went into exile. So what was the civil war about, and why did it sort of end? Why did its first phase end? Well, it was not only about looting, theft, power-hungry militia commanders, and sadistic murderers and killers. I mean, all this happened. But I believe ultimately it was to do with the features of the new Iraq, especially in terms of the permanence of the switch and control from the previous Sunni Arab domination to the new Shia ascendancy. On another level, it was to do with the institutional, legal, and political makeup of post-invasion Iraq, what I have called the second Iraqi state. And this civil war ended when the insurgents, the bulwark of the former regime, such as army and security officers, Ba'ath Party operatives, and tribal leaders, recognized that they could not win this war for two fundamental reasons. The first is a very simple one, is that the Shia, and to a lesser extent the Kurds, if you add them together, they account for nearly 80% of the country. And you can't win a civil war with 20% of the population. So this is a simple arithmetic number. The second one was that in the period after 2003, which ended and the civil war went, actually, the Shia basically dominated the state and controlled its resources and controlled the military. So it is very, very difficult, I think, with these factors to have anything more than a one-sided confrontation. The main factor behind the continuation of the civil war was the strategy that they would drag the other Arab countries into it and thereby tip the demographic majority in Iraq into a minority. Well, that really didn't happen. And the fact that a large number of people left Iraq after 2006, mainly the population, mainly the Sunni Arab population, Shias tended to be displaced internally rather than going to exile, cut off, as it were, the population base for the insurgents. And that's when the opening took place that the United States exploited very successfully by co-opting key leaders of the tribes who were involved in the insurgency to switch sides. It was also, I think, compounded by the terrible strategic mistakes of Al-Qaeda, especially its really brutalities in the territories at which it controlled and their indiscriminate terror campaign. I think it pushed a lot of people over the edge who would have supported them under different conditions. But I still believe that the main drive that ended the civil war was a cold calculation on the part of the main groups, the Sunni Arab groups, the insurgents, tribal leaders, that the new Iraq, the control over the new Iraq, was not going to be bombed out of existence, and that you had to, in fact, switch tactics, not necessarily strategy, to try to push your views or your vision of the new state. And also, this is somewhat controversial, I also believe that the two foreign parties who could have done most to stop the civil war didn't, Iran and the United States. I think they were involved in it, either through omission or commission, it doesn't really matter. There's no doubt that Iran played a very significant advisory and support role in guiding the militias in the run-up to the civil war and even during the fighting itself. And the United States during the civil war did not move its forces to divide the competing groups, to actually dominate the neighborhoods where there was civil strife going on, at least not until the surge took place. By that time it was too late. So I believe that there was a kind of not benign neglect, maybe malicious neglect, that allowed the war to continue until certain facts were realized, as it were, on the landscape. But still, the civil war which ended did not really resolve the key issues that have still been left festering. And they include things like Kurdish regional demands, the status of the city of Kirkuk, which sits on top of a very large oil field in the north, which has a complex ethnic and sectarian makeup, the nature of Iraqi federalism, provincial and regional powers. These are still have not been resolved. The way in which the oil industry should be developed in terms of revenue sharing, although we've had some important advances in terms of giving major contracts, major service contracts to international oil companies to develop our major oil resources. The Constitution of 2005 was approved by the Sunni Arab parties in government only on the condition that key elements of it would be renegotiated after it was ratified. And these still have not yet been resolved. So these are issues that continue to fester in the background. Nearly all the parliamentary groups today, it may change in the next elections, but today are based on ethnic and sectarian divisions. They're not based on issues or ideas. The governing coalition that had ran Iraq from 2004 until maybe last year was based on a fundamental alliance between two groups, between the dominant Kurdish political parties, the Kurdish Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan on the one hand, and the Shia parties, particularly the Islamic Supreme Council represented by the Hakim family. There was a very, very powerful bond between the two that allowed them to dominate parliamentary politics. This is beginning to fray. In fact, it's frayed. The Shia alliance, which was grouped under one political entity, initially backed by the religious establishment of Najaf, in particular Ayatollah Sistani, began to break up last year as a result of factional fighting and the drive for power by its major component groups, in particular the group associated with the Prime Minister. So these fundamental relationships that gave some kind of continuity to the political class broke up. And now we're facing an entirely different environment, whereby the political makeup is not based anymore on these fundamental alliances, but rather on the drive for power by the components of these groups. The main factor that broke up, especially the Shia alliance, was the desire of the Prime Minister's party to assume, as it were, control over the state and the state apparatus. And this became manifested in early 2009, when under strong internal pressure, the Prime Minister moved against the militias of the Mahdi army in the city of Basra, which is Iraq's second city and is the center of the oil trade, the oil provinces of the south. Basra had slipped under the control of these people, and they were ruling it in a really disastrous way as far as the civil population was concerned. And it was a major move on the part of the Prime Minister, a major gamble, because the Iraqi army was not prepared to enter into this kind of confrontation. In the end, the United States Air Force came to the rescue, and what was a possible defeat turned into a major victory, which then the Prime Minister naturally used to strengthen his own position and his own claims to undivided power. This was the impetus, which was then rolled into the successes that his party had, and relative success that his party had in the provincial elections of 2009, thereby increasing the sense that his party was going to dominate, if not Iraqi politics, at least Shia politics. A similar set of fragmentation took place amongst other groups. In the Kurdish case, what we think of as the stability and continuity in Kurdistan, the northern part of Iraq, was severely shaken by the provincial or by the regional elections in Kurdistan, where a third party arose called Change, which got a significant share of the vote, up to a quarter, perhaps even more, assuming you believe in the accusations of fraud. So the hold of these parties on Kurdistan began to wobble. In the Sunni Arab community, the same thing began to happen. The Sunni Arab groups were built upon the hardcore of three groups. One is the Iraq offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an international Islamic party based in Egypt. Another one were tribal elements and former officers who were one way or another connected with the former regime. They also had an important some political role. And the third group was those associated with basically independent regional figures who may or may not have been connected with the former regime. These entities had cohered in a bloc, but that bloc has since begun to fragment. What you face now is we have elections coming up in March 2007, where two forces are at work. One force is an attempt to create a kind of non-sectarian, non-ethnic based group, partly composed of various elements of these political parties. And there's a counter trend to that, is the resurrection, what I would call, of the politics of fear and uncertainty, whereby the people are, as it were, stampeded into voting for their sect or for their ethnic group. These are the two overall competing currents. Of course, they're manifested or they're reflected in different kinds of political arrangements. But these are the two main forces trying to vie for power inside the Iraqi political landscape. In the background, there is the violence that you read about, the bombings and the killings and so on. But it is not so much designed, as it was before, to bring down the new order. It is designed to influence the distribution of power, I believe, between various political groups. So, I mean, the bombings that have taken place in Baghdad are less to do with random killings and trying to ignite a civil war, and more to do with trying to prove that the government is unable to control security or to provide security for the common man. Targeted assassinations are also pushed in that direction to increase and to change the local power arrangements. None of these, I think, is going to lead now to the, as it were, the implosion of the country into a new civil war or a complete disintegration. This is very, very unlikely. Al-Qaeda as an entity has not completely gone away. What exists in Iraq is now very much, as it were, the Iraqi franchise for Al-Qaeda. But most of its main operatives had moved last year to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And now it seems the main interest in the area is in Yemen. So in that case, I think it's no longer a threat to the long-term order. It will be a contributing factor in terms of the political, the way the political issues are going to be resolved. But it's more a supportive role for various parties rather than an independent force trying to impose its will through through abuse of power and terror. But we have a state right now that is, by and large, in terms of its day-to-day management, in a very poor state. I would even say it's appalling. The bureaucracy is very, very dysfunctional. It has not changed significantly in terms of its composition and its methods from the days when it managed a totalitarian state. And it is driven by stifling procedures, incompetence, backward systems, and very opaque practices. I'm sure you've heard of the incredible levels of corruption in Iraq, where Transparency International lists it as the second from the bottom. And corruption has reached to the highest echelons of government. I mean, I have always said that this level of corruption in Iraq is not something that you wink at. It is really a national security issue and can destroy the chances of a successful reconstruction of the economy. I don't think we have a democratic culture yet. Democracy is very much in a formalistic sense operates in Iraq. We have elections, of course, but the other paraphernalia which constitutes the rule of law, the political culture, or the state of mind that is part of a democratic culture, we're very, very far away from that. And I don't think that the political parties that we have are in any ways more representative than just groups that represent their particular ethnicities or sects or their own particular families that dominate them. We have parliamentarians and high state officials who are not really qualified for their jobs and positions. We have ministers who are not entirely aware of the demands of their role, frequently slipping into corruption. We have a political class now that emerged after 2003 that is still groping for a way in which it can adhere or cohere as a long-term governing class, and has not yet formed the requirements to be able to govern the country effectively. And the whole affair, in the final analysis, is kept alive by, I think, two factors. One is the relatively high oil price that has affected the Iraqi public finances since 2003, and the large-scale presence of the United States military, which has always been the single most important factor in establishing security and stability. They've also been a factor in instability and insecurity, but at least when it comes to the dominance over all other armed groups, it's not the Iraqi army that does the heavy lifting, it is the US forces. What that happens in the future is another matter. Oil, Iraq is very dependent on oil. It's probably the most dependent on oil of all the oil-producing countries, even those that have very small populations. Something like 90% of the state budget revenues come from oil. And the state accounts for something like 75% of GDP. So you're talking about a very lopsided economy that survives as a result of relatively high oil prices. And this has been the pattern since 2004, when Iraq took control over its finances. Before that, the oil price was between 2003 and 2004 under direct occupation. Oil was not really an issue because the US was meeting all the budgetary aspects of it. So if oil prices continue at this level, Iraq will continue to be relatively well off in terms of the amount of revenues coming into the central treasury. Its unemployment problems will be to some extent relieved by the huge expansion on the state payroll, and the investment and reconstruction opportunities will be there because of the amount of surplus funds that can be allocated to reconstruction. In this year's budget, the 2010 budget, we're talking about a forecast revenues of around $75 billion, nearly double the time when I was the Minister of Finance. This was only 3 years ago. And the amount allocated to the investment sector is something like $20 billion, which is also a significant advance. So as long as oil prices stay at this level, the economy will not jeopardize the stability of the second Iraqi state. If oil prices fall to $50 or below, I think it will be a serious, serious crisis that may even threaten the survival of the second Iraqi state. That doesn't mean it will go back, but this constellation of factors may not necessarily continue. Last year, for example, when oil prices did dip below to levels of $30 or $40, we had a significant budgetary problem. And when I say a budgetary problem, it cannot easily be solved the way it has by increasing indebtedness or by access to international borrowings and so on. There's no other money available in Iraq except for oil. The US has reduced its commitment to the Iraqi economy, and Iraq is not normally a commercially creditworthy country, so the only other access it has is to the IMF. So oil will continue to be an important behind-the-scenes factor in the stability of the second Iraqi state. Of course, the events of 2003, and I'll try to bring this to a close now, had a significant, as I earlier said, significant impact on the regional order. And I will not be exaggerating by saying it's probably the single most important event in terms of regional balance of power since World War I. The whole regional Middle Eastern balance of power has been turned upside down inside Iraq. And you can see why. In the case, if you look at each of the countries around Iraq and see how it was affected by the change. In the case of Turkey, the empowerment of the Kurds has created a momentum that they have to come to terms with. Nearly, the figures vary, but between 20 to 30% of Turkey is made out of Kurds. And if there's a move at some point in the future towards a Kurdish state, then obviously that's going to threaten the national security interests of Turkey. And Turkey's intervention in Iraq, at least in the early days, was to limit the potential of that taking place. Now, of course, Turkey is a major player in Iraq, as well as the broader Middle East. It has, in one way or another, and this has not been looked at very carefully, the change of balance inside Iraq has allowed Turkey to increase its scope and its influence in the region. I'm not saying they're going to recreate an Ottoman Empire, but all you have to do is to see the way in which the Turks have begun to strengthen their relationships with all their nearby Arab countries, and increasing talk of coordination, increasing talk of increasing trade, investment, and so on, is now the order of the day, rather than the former Kemalist policy of ignoring the Asiatic hinterland, as it were, and looking west all the time. By and large, I think on one side, as I said, is the risk of the Kurdish state affecting the national security of Turkey. On the other side is the access that Turkey now has into the power corridors of the Arab countries, including a large number of Iraqi politicians, Arab politicians, who look to Turkey for support and advice. Iran, of course, is the biggest winner in this whole thing, because something that was completely inconceivable 10 years ago happened. And that is a state dominated by a single-minded totalitarian dictatorship, which has entered into war with Iran and caused them untold damage, dominated by a highly secularized, later it was dominated by, as it were, anti-Iranian rhetoric, changed into something else, into something where a large number of players in Baghdad are now very, very close to Iran. So it was a major, significant victory for Iran, and empowered it in a part of the world which has been seeking to gain access to and influence for a long time. Kuwait is the other country, if you go around in a clockwise, where Kuwait obviously benefited from the overthrow of a dictator and of a country that had cancelled its existence in 1990. So to them it was an unalloyed blessing. But the way that Kuwait handles its relationships with Iraq is very, very standoffish and very careful. They have not yet formulated a long-term policy regarding Iraq, partly I think because Iraq has not yet taken a final shape. The Gulf countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, feel extremely threatened by what has happened in Iraq for a variety of reasons. And in the Saudi case, it's to do, first of all, with the shift of power to a Shia Arab dominance, which is one way or another seen to be influenced by Iran. It will have untold effects on the role of the Shia Arabs of the Gulf countries, where they are in a majority in Bahrain, a strong minority in Kuwait, and a large minority in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and goes against the prevailing ideological rhetoric, as it were, of the Saudi clerical establishment. So in one form or another, they have been the most affected amongst the Arab countries by the changeover of regime in Baghdad. Jordan is a more complex case. It is trying to come to terms with the new order, but it had benefited a great deal from the old order. It was a conduit for Iraq to the international community, to the international arena in the 1990s, and it's trying now to achieve some kind of privileged relationship, but still is unsure about the permanence of this change. Syria, on one side, has seen the removal of a factional enemy, but on the other side, it has seen a state which was very much similar to it in terms of its institutions and its power being dismantled, and does feel and continues to feel threatened by the direction of change in Iraq. Of course, the events in Iraq, because they've changed this power balance between the main sects of Islam inside the Middle East, has had even greater repercussions on the broader broader Islamic world, especially in terms of the escalation of tensions between the two communities of Islam in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, and now in Pakistan. All of these, I think, are the background, as it were, as to where we go from here. I believe that we can salvage a good future for Iraq if a number of preconditions are met, in spite of the disturbing and turbulent background that I have described. First, for inside domestic Iraqi politics, I think there must be at some point, and I think this will come up after the elections of 2009, the opportunity of 2010, the opportunity to create a new political force that will be somehow distant from its sectarian and ethnic affiliations, but nevertheless one that recognizes the permanence of the changes that have taken place. There's no doubt there's a huge resentment amongst the public against the incompetence and corruption of the government. And there's also a sense amongst Iraqis that pure sectarian politics may have had its day, even though some parties are trying to resurrect it now, and that it should not govern the pattern of Iraq's political life. There has to be, I think, a governing vision for the country. There has to be some attempt to create a platform around which all Iraqis can subscribe and can build their future on. And it is to do with what I earlier said, is to create a sense of nationhood amongst these disparate parts, partly based on the promise of better governance and a better standard of living. And this vision and promise still has to deal with the fact that sectarian and identity politics is still rooted in Iraq. And there will be fierce resistance to these changes. But you have to build these things methodically over the next few years if such a party is going to be able to, as it were, embody the new vision for the country. There are a lot of problems associated with that, including the fact that the opposition is much better funded, the people who are now governing the country have access to state resources and various rackets that continue, but still, I think an opportunity will arise. The second precondition, I think, is to articulate a vision and a plan that will reconcile the region as a whole with what I think are the irreversible changes that have taken place in Iraq, and to produce an economic and political vision for the region as a whole, in which Iraq as a country should then champion. And it will have to be based, I think, on a kind of post-confederal vision for the Middle East that will be much more based on economic integration, much more based on trade, much more based on creating common institutions that in time may take over some of the national functions, especially in areas of protection of communities, of civil rights, of human rights, and so on. And if this happens, I think, if these two factors happen, and they are centered around Iraq, the rise of a group, a political party, a movement, or whatnot, that will seriously try to transcend the factional and identity politics on the one side, based, as I said, on the promise of better governance and a better political and economic order. And on the other hand, Iraq to champion, as it were, an open, not just an open economy, but integration with its neighbors, improving transport links, improving energy links, improving the ease of communication, movements of people, movements of capital, over in a planned, methodical way over the next decade or so, and then spilling into the broader region, not just the Arab world, but including countries of Iran, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, even Pakistan, bringing them into a kind of cohesive West Asia bloc that would be fit into the regional blocs that are now increasingly important in the world. I think it can, the whole thing can be turned around and can be turned into something much more positive than this turbulent and very violent and contorted past that we had. So finally, I would say that we have to embrace our diversity, the way I suppose Singapore has, the way that other successful multi-ethnic states have. Not just in some kind of vague call for pluralism and multi-ethnicity, but rather to try to construct this nationhood, as it were, of different parts, based on a commonly accepted theme, in which Iraq is seen as a gateway to the broader regions. There was a third issue, which seems to have a third precondition, which may have loomed large and may continue to loom large, but not now, and that is Iraq's relationship with the United States. I mean, the US, when all is said and done, will probably have spent nearly $3 trillion on this adventure. President Obama wants out, and I think the US military will mainly leave by August, leaving a residual force. How that relationship is going to be maintained in the future, on what basis, what terms and conditions, is something that has to be, I think, carefully looked at. There are many advantages in having cordial, long-term relationships with a superpower. But these relationships, I think, should not include being part of a military strategic treaty, as it were, in which Iraq fits into a US military strategy in the area. It should be based more on cooperation, be based more on sharing, and be based more on economic, cultural, and other relationships. Finally, I would like to just conclude with another imponderable, and that is, there's nothing sacrosanct or inevitable, as I have tried to say, about the survival of the second Iraqi state. It might also disintegrate, not because of wars of aggression that brought the demise of the first Iraqi state, but because it has lost relevance or meaning to some or most of its inhabitants. Of course, on a happier note, the institutions of the second Iraqi state may dissolve into a broader confederal arrangement. That's good news. But this state itself, if it doesn't hold because its parts wanted to stay together, will, as Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And I think this applies to the United States in the Civil War. It applies to any country in which people are pitted against each other for power and advantage rather than sharing and accommodating each other in a broader and larger goal. And if we don't find ways of living together and enjoy living together, which is another precondition, there's no point living together if we don't enjoy it, then I think this nation of disparate parts that I hope will emerge may not hold together. I think it will, because at the social level, Iraqis have not allowed these terrible conflicts. Although in the last few years they nearly came to it, to dominate the way that they treat their neighbors and their fellow citizens. So the jury is still out, with a lot of goodwill, a lot of effort, a lot of hard work. I think we can pull it together, but there are very difficult obstacles on the way. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think following that tour de force by Dr. Allawi, we have about half an hour for questions and answers. He's very kindly agreed to stay on to speak with you. There's a gentleman in the middle. If you could please, when you come up to speak, identify yourself and try and keep your questions to the point.
V.K. Rajan from Chesterton Suntec International, Singapore. Dr. Allawi, thank you very much for your analysis and giving us the historical political context. I have an observation followed by a question. I'm not sure whether you can speak of Middle East order. From my observation for some time, there's more disorder than order. Anyway, be that as it may, when is this daily loss of life in Iraq going to end? And by extension, will democracy and rule of law succeed in Iraq when it has not so much succeeded in many of the Arab states? And US is trying to impose its version of democracy and rule of law. But many of the Arab states which do not practice this are actively supported by US, and some of them may even depend for their survival on US support. Thank you.
Shall I answer the questions? Yes. I think on the violence side, I try to say that the violence will continue, but not on the scale and scope as before. Violence is now used to advance political goals, and this happens in nearly all countries where this is, tolerated. It's no different from the violence that affects campaigns in Colombia and the Philippines and Pakistan and so on. It may be of a larger scale in Iraq, but the killings and bombings that take place are to do more with achieving political ends rather than overthrowing the regime. So as long as this kind of violence is not seen to achieve political success, even though it's horrible to say that, it will continue, I'm afraid. Democracy and rule of law, how stable, how permanent it is in Iraq, I think the forms of democracy are relatively, you can say that they will continue. But whether the spirit of democracy, which is more important than the forms, the abiding by rules, abiding by the rule of law, abiding by conventions, a spirit of accepting political loss as part of accepting the parameters of a larger system, these, I think, are not likely to be established. It's still, democracy is seen to be mainly in electoral terms, seen to be mainly in terms of fighting elections and winning elections rather than creating a democratic culture. The US, I think, my contact with Americans, and I've been in the United States for the last year or so at Harvard and Princeton, and I think they've had it with Iraq. At least the public has. They want out. Whether the United States was responsible for this escalation in violence, not directly, but indirectly, yes, because of gross mismanagement of the country and the negligence, bordering in some cases on criminal negligence, on major aspects of the post-2003 order. You said that the Middle East, there's no order. There's an order under the disorder. And it is that I was referring to, that the unstated principles that govern Middle Eastern governments and power.
Lady in the third row.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for a very informative speech. I'm Jessica from LKY School, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm a Master of Public Policy student. I'd like to ask you one question. During the talk, you mentioned that the Iraq war has done a lot of damages to the Iraq and US relations. So I'm wondering, suppose that you are in power for the United States government, on retrospect, what would you have done differently than the Bush administration? And looking forward, supposing now you are a consultant for President Obama, what would you advise him to do to improve the relationships between United States and Iraq? Thank you very much.
Well, on the first part of the question, what would I have done differently? I wrote a book on it, so you can see what I think on that. I think the major issue was that the United States did not know why it was doing this. They invaded the country under false premises, and these false promises, not promises but premises, caught up with them very, very soon thereafter. Either you invade a country and try to make over its political culture, or you invade it and hand it over to people as quickly as possible and get out. This kind of halfway house where you want to control events and control the flow of events with people who are not necessarily aware of what's going on, with constant changes in personnel, constant changes in policy directions, and with a military that also is going through different phases and trying to come to terms with the country, was a recipe for disaster. So it's a whole litany, so you can't choose one and say, if they did this, this would have happened. The major issue, I think, of the United States is that it invaded the country with very little information about it, very little pre-war planning, very little vision for what it was going to do with it after it had, because it was never a military confrontation. There's no question that the Iraqi army was going to be defeated. I mean, basically disintegrated without fighting. What I would tell President Obama to do, and I probably would not take the job, but if I was asked I think they should disengage from the military as soon as possible and as quickly as possible. Do to some extent what they're doing now, maintain a residual force that would look at the terrorist aspects and the spread of or the control over Al-Qaeda, and build on the economic and commercial relationships and try to exert as much direct and indirect pressure on the country, on the governing class, to improve the quality of government. The quality of government in Iraq is really appalling, and it has a lot to do with the political class that emerged after 2003. Now, obviously, I was part of it up to a point, so it's self-condemnation, but this is a question of numbers, not a question of individuals. There's always individuals who are good or think they're good. But as a group, the political class that has emerged is neither competent, nor democratic, nor inclined to recreate the political culture of the country. So we might end up with the worst of all worlds, democracy that is really a semi-authoritarian front for a rule of factions. I don't think many people like that, would like that.
The lady in the third row.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you were speaking on the importance of oil revenue.
Could you please identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Mary Stonecker. I was wondering, in regards to the importance of oil revenue on Iraq's budget, do you believe that Russia's opening of its oil reserves will affect Iraqi oil prices and then, importantly, the financial strength of Iraq? Thank you.
Well, the oil revenues, the forecast is that production would double every 4 or 5 years. I personally believe that. I think it will happen. There are a lot of skeptics in there, but there's a lot of oil out there. And the service contracts negotiated by the oil minister have been, I think, impeccable. They are really very, very good for the country. And I say that, I mean, I'm not part of the political group that it was a marvelous job. The question is now whether the oil companies are going to come at the speed and at the rate that we expect. I think they will. They're already beginning to mobilize. So sometime around the end of this year, we will see serious oil production coming up. The main question now is how will Iraq be accommodated in the structures of OPEC? And what would happen if Iraq doubles and redoubles its oil production in the next 8 years? There will be, if it happens without disruptions to OPEC, it will have obviously a drag on oil prices. I don't think it will be as easy as that. I think many people, those large producers in OPEC, may not willingly accede to Iraq raising its quotas. I mean, the argument that Iraq should raise its quotas is that we have not been part of OPEC because of wars and sanctions for the last. We've been part of OPEC, but we've not had to abide by their quota systems. And our natural quota was given to others. That's what Iraqis would claim. Others would say no, that we've made investments in these fields and we want to maintain our level of production. The biggest quote-unquote losers, unless there's a great surge in global demand for oil, are going to be the major OPEC producers, Saudi Arabia and to a lesser extent Iran. Russia opening up its reserves that you mentioned, all these I think are drags, and it's a question of how long will the oil economy last for. My own opinion is that we have in Iraq, I'm speaking as an Iraqi now, we have a window of around 20 years. Beyond, if we don't get our act in order in this period, by increasing production, by diversifying the economy in this period, the oil age would pass. I'm not saying that oil will go down to zero, but there will be, by and large, I believe in the peak oil argument. And there will be a kind of plateau of demand and then a long-term secular decline. So selling into an oversupplied market 20 years from now, assuming there isn't a great surge in demand amongst China and India and so on, is not very good for oil prices. That's why it's really critical that we have to do this sooner rather than later. I think the pressure would be to increase production soon.
The gentleman on the right.
Yeah, my name is Ang Sin Hock. I do business. Just had one short question. Okay. What do you think, do you think, do you see the possibility of a Hamid Karzai phenomenon in Iraq?
Hamid Karzai phenomenon, I suppose you mean a presidential figure winning a contested election? Is that what you mean?
Something like that, but in view of what you said about the corruption level in Iraq and the PM's group.
Well, it's not just the PMs. I'm not accusing any of this man or that man. I'm just saying that it's become a culture. It's a pervasive culture, and it affects the highest levels of government. And unless it's treated, it will be a national security issue, in the sense that you cannot be able to attract foreign investment if you want to import a box of Kleenex. You have to pay a bribe. You can't do that. You cannot expect international investors to come and help in Iraq's reconstruction if the bureaucracy is so inefficient and dysfunctional. So a large aspects of Iraq's reconstruction are a function of the quality of its governing institutions. And if these governing institutions are not, including the rule of law, including commercial courts, if these are not rectified soon, we will have to rely only on ourselves rather than on the flow of foreign investment coming in. So it's critical that this issue is recognized and it's treated appropriately. But because of the political deals that are being made in order to stay in power, corrupt people, corrupt practices, corrupt procedures, opaque procedures, bankrupt practices, these continue as if they are the prevailing norm. So a phenomenon whereby this has to be overturned, not because of newspaper pious arguments. It has to be overturned by a change in the political culture. That these things is not seen, that political office is not an entitlement to rob people. That the fact that you have licensing power does not give you the right to stop people. The fact that you are a judge does not mean that you have to hold your commercial decisions, your judgments, because of this personal advantage or that. This culture, which I must say in Iraq was beginning to die out in the 1960s and 70s, has come back with a vengeance in the last decade. And without its reform, other countries that have not been able to tackle their real development issues without coming to terms with good government, good governance.
Yes?
My name is Mohammed Mehdi. I'm the Chief Executive of National Singapore. Sir, I would like to ask you one question. What do you think another emerging superpower, China, would have a role in Iraq? As I have seen and read an article in Herald Tribune where America is doing all the cleaning up work and China is coming and doing some commercial deals, which a $3.2 billion deal in Afghanistan mining and oil deal in Iraq. I would like to have a comment on that. Thank you.
Well, I think China has developed deep inroads into the Iraqi economy, as well as into the major Iraqi reconstruction programs. As you know, they have one field to themselves, one of the oil fields to themselves, the Ahdab field in Kut, which has maybe 100,000 barrels a day output. They're also in partnership with major international companies, majors, in the development of major oil fields. So China is there, and it's playing a fundamental part in the reconstruction of the Iraqi oil sector. In terms of the market, it has penetrated the Iraqi market the way it has all other markets of the Middle East for a huge array of goods. And I think it's very difficult in the broader area of construction, it's very difficult to see how a properly organized bid from Chinese companies cannot win. This is an argument now that's becoming more and more, you hear it louder in America, that we gave our blood and treasure so that others can pick the fruits. But generally Americans have a sort of a short-term mentality, and the money that they have spent is sunk cost. They will have to compete, I think, with the understanding that, except for the military procurement, they will not be given any special break. And the fact that most of the oil contracts went to non-American companies is not so much indicative of the fact that the Iraqi government is choosing non-American companies. It's more like Americans themselves are not bidding for these contracts. So in areas where they have natural advantage, military supplies, aircrafts and so on, I think perhaps in agriculture, the Iraqi market is not beholden to the United States. And in that case, I think there is a strong case to be made to open up internationally. I think Chinese companies will benefit. Nobody is stopping them making these deep inroads.
Anthony?
Anthony Teo from NTU. In your discussion, you cited quite a number of countries in the Middle East. One of which you did not quite mention was Lebanon. It has a very troubled past. It has got many wars in its territory. It's got foreign occupation and all. But the sense of positive thinking in Lebanon is so positive. Why is that? Compared to Iraq, as you described.
Well, because Lebanon is populated by Lebanese. Iraqis are positive. I'm not trying not to be, but it's just that we've had a very troubled recent history. Lebanon has not gone through the traumas that we went through. They didn't have to fight an 8-year war. They were not ruled by... I mean, now people look at the Saddam regime and compare it to what happened after 2003, but the period in which Iraqis were living under that regime was terrible. People forget that nearly 300,000 people were killed as a result of the insurrection of 1991. There has been terrible, terrible crimes committed. Lebanon is to some extent more positive because there's a large Lebanese diaspora outside that have helped the country. There's probably about 12 million people of Lebanese origin around the world. They've always outward-looking people. They've always traveled whenever the situation is difficult in their countries. They've populated many countries in South America. Brazil has several million Lebanese, people of Lebanese origin. The United States, West Africa, and now large parts of the Gulf economies are run by Lebanese at the daily level, at the level of operators and managers and so on. Lebanon, I mean, you would not have made this argument in 1982, 83, when it was in the middle of a civil war. But no matter, again, what you say about the possible incidences of corruption and so on, they had a very decisive, dynamic leadership in the form of the late Rafiq al-Hariri, who did huge amounts of work and put his personal fortune on the line to help reconstruct the country. So Lebanon, there are visible episodes and evidence of new work, of reconstruction, of forward thinking, of progressive thinking, while at the same time there's the other aspect of it. So far in Iraq, if you look at the post-2003 environment, and I say that really very sadly, you can't point to anything and say this is a result of the successful operations of post-2003. The Americans spent billions of dollars, directly and indirectly, there's nothing to show for it. I mean, the electricity is still in terrible shape, the roads are in terrible shape, the schools are barely functioning, the government hasn't changed, the economy is still oil dependent. Agriculture now, which used to account for 18% of GDP 15 years ago, it's now 3%. We have very serious water problems in Iraq, where there is a very serious chance that we have drought in our agricultural sector. Industries account for 1% of GDP. So there's been a degradation of the components of the national economy. Partly, don't blame the Americans or anybody else for that. It's just the natural course of wars as a consequence of wars and disasters like that. But I agree with that. Lebanon exudes an air of optimism and of activity, of dynamism. I think also because in Lebanon these adjustments take place once every 20, 30 years. There's a big shake, like tectonic plates, and then things stay quiet for a period. In Iraq, we have not been used to this kind of, I mean, it has always been either a dictatorial society in the last 30 years, or military controlled, or some way, some form of, or another of authoritarian or totalitarian rule. And Iraqis have been cut off from the world. For a long time. Their mindset, those who speak English are probably in their 60s now. The entire generation cannot communicate. It's changing now. But those in their 30s and 40s and 50s have been out of touch with the world. So there's a lot of mitigating circumstances. But I think Iraqis are generally open people. They are people who look out, who want to see their country accessible. They are not xenophobic. They like outsiders coming and visiting. They're very open. They're very accommodating. It will be a matter, I think, of time, hopefully short term, before this comes back again.
If I could have a show of hands to ask questions. I will adopt a slightly different approach now. If I could maybe get you to put your questions one by one, and then we will write them down, and then Dr. Allawi will try and deal with them all so that we can finish in time for lunch. Please.
Farid Alatas from Malay Studies, NUS. A very simple question. Could you say something about the ownership and control of Iraqi oil? What are the contentious issues? What do you see as the main problems? Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman at the back. Yes.
Lim Sui King. Two points to share. One is I learned from Central Banker of Bangladesh 2 days ago. Bangladesh have reached gold reserve, but they never dare to touch it, because if they touch it, they worry the country will go into chaos like what you face. The second point is what I have shared with Senator Lugar before the appointment of General Petraeus, is that nobody can blame America, because it became the sole superpower. And it's so tempting to secure their most important resources that they need for their economy. So the most important thing is that America should practice what the China has done.
Do you have a question for Dr. Allawi?
I think this is important sharing, because that shaped the change of the policy in Iraq.
Is there a question for Dr. Allawi?
No, it's not. It's a comment. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The gentleman across the aisle. Yes.
Yes, Muhammad Nasrin from University Brunei Darussalam. I have a question. Basically, my questions can be basically grouped in one group that is basically what is the role of the Shi'i community in regards to the nation building. And I think I've read in one of your writings, finally a blueprint for peace of Iraq, sometime back in the Independent, that you said that one of the most important things is that for the officials or for the Americans to speak to Iran. And now that you've given the impression saying that most Iraqi officials are close to Iran, does this mean that some ideas of Iranian governance is being transferred to the Iraqi understanding? Thank you.
Thank you. And just one more, I think, at the back, and then we will call it quits.
Muhammad Rusli from Jafari Association.
Yes.
The term Shia crescent used by King Abdullah from Jordan, is it a realistic threat to the stability of Middle East in the future? Thank you.
We have a very wide range of questions. Dr.
Well,
Lloyd.
the second one is a comment, so I'll not answer that. But regarding Said Farid's question on ownership and control of oil, in spite of what people say, Iraq's oil is owned by Iraq. I mean, there was some talk that the Americans have stolen the oil and all of that. That's not true. There are three major issues in Iraqi oil. One is the issue of development of the fields which have already been demarcated and delineated. This was going on for several years, and it was finally resolved by the issue of service contracts. Iraqis were very loath to sign production sharing agreements because of the history of the dominance of the oil industry by the Iraq Petroleum Company, which was part of the BP-led consortium. So there was a reluctance to even consider production sharing. And this dragged out the oil negotiations until finally the oil companies accepted Iraq's terms, which are very, very stringent. So here we have about 6 major oil contracts have been given to international oil companies as service contracts, with the commitment on their part to increase production against a per barrel fee. And politically, I think this has been the main issue here is when they are going to begin to implement the production increases. The second issue of Iraqi oil relates to who owns Iraq's oil resources. Is it the federal government? Is it the provincial governments? The constitution that was written in 2005 says contradictory things. On one hand, it says that the oil and all natural resources are owned by the people, thereby implying the central government. And there's another clause in the Constitution which says that provincial authorities own the natural rights over the natural resources, and that in dispute, provincial law is superior to federal law. This, of course, was done mainly at the behest of the Kurds, so that their laws take prevalence over central laws, and that therefore they will be entitled to give production sharing agreements or to invite oil companies or any other kind of mining enterprise into their region without reference to the central government. This issue is still outstanding, and it's bedeviling the third issue, which is what happens to those companies who are operating now in Kurdistan, who are producing this year about 100,000 barrels a day, and next year can go up to 500,000 barrels a day. What happens to their exports and to their contracts, and how does the Kurdish government compensate them for their production if they are in dispute with the central government? On top of all of that is the technical managerial issues that the oil industry faces. It requires massive investments, which now mercifully will be done mainly by the foreign oil companies. But the actual regulatory body is very, very weak. The ministry itself has competent people, but getting on. Many of them have left the country, so you need to rebuild the central ministerial cadre. And we have to start our own national oil company that would be, in one way or another, given production over some of the existing fields, and become a serious competitor domestically and internationally. These are, I think, the main oil issues. There are downstream issues. We have problems in refining. Our refineries are really out of date. We're large importers of gasoline, diesel, LPG, and so on. And you have to attract investments in that sector. If the foreign sector does not step up, the government will have to do that, because the Iraqi private sector is too small to finance major refinery projects like that. So ownership and control, it's not in the hands of foreigners, it's in the hands of Iraqis, mainly or overwhelmingly in the hands of the national government, with some fields in dispute with the Kurdish authorities. The two questions raised regarding the Shia, one is whether what part do they play in the building up the nation, and how does that the idea of the nation, how does that relate to the Iranian system of the rule of the jurisprudence? I think these are very pertinent questions, because the Shia, being the majority in the country, have to articulate a vision for the country which not only serves their interests, serves the interests of the other people who are also their co-citizens. And so far, there has not been such an articulated vision. It has more to do with recovering of rights rather than with working out a vision which all the entire nation can subscribe to. And if it's not done, I think it's a very important issue, because it is up to them, I think, to come up with this vision, and to come and through discussions and through conferences and through dealing with leaders of the other communities, come up with a set of shared principles. That the Constitution is supposed to do that, but beyond that, power sharing that's to do with the way in which majorities can rule without ruling as majorities, in which minorities can continue to maintain political rights and aspire to the highest political office without feeling excluded, different ethnicities. This requires a completely new way of looking at the problems in Iraq, rather than the old way which was formulated, which is recovery of rights, defensiveness, and the politics of never again, which seems to have dominated. As for the idea of the rule of the jurisprudent, I think it's next to impossible to happen in Iraq for a variety of reasons. I think, one, it has no popular base. Nobody wants to be ruled in a system of government that's similar to Iran's. Not that they don't respect the religious classes, that's a different matter. But giving rule to creating a clerical ruling class is just not feasible in terms of Iraq political culture. The other aspect of it is that the senior religious authority in Iraq doesn't want to do that. So who's going to do that? I mean, it becomes a very difficult issue to promote, and no political party of any consequence has built itself up on the back of an open acknowledgement of the rule of the jurisprudent. The Shia crescent as a threat, I think it still is there. This has been driving politics since I think the Iranian Revolution in the Middle East, and will continue to be a driver of politics. And sometimes it waxes, sometimes it wanes, sometimes it becomes a stated policy, sometimes it's not. Now I think we are in a period where it's likely to exacerbate rather than to quieten down. And it depends on the quality of leadership. The signals I've seen so far, and there'll be a talk on this tomorrow, I've seen so far are really don't augur well. Especially in the last 3 or 4 months, there's been some very, very incendiary statements made by leading Saudi clerics. First against the Shia as a whole, and secondly against the Shia clerical class, which is difficult to square with the intention of creating a kind of pan-Islamic, non-sectarian concord. So many people still feel deeply threatened by this shift inside Iraq, and they see Iraq as still suspiciously of that somehow a cat's paw for Iran. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we cannot take all your questions. If I can thank on your behalf Dr. Allawi for a most insightful talk, which I think has also demanded quite a bit of stamina on his part. I think I speak for all of you when I say I have learnt a tremendous amount from Dr. Allawi, and I'd like you to join me in expressing our appreciation.